Oh, hello everybody, this is Bhante Joe here, and I'm just here at Endagala, which is a kind of ruin in the forest where I've recorded a couple of videos before, and thought to record a short half-hour or so Dhamma talk for the TBC in Toronto. So I thought I could start with a little bit of chanting. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. So hope that everybody is having a great day in Toronto. It's now the beginning of the Vasana season in Sri Lanka. Started just a couple days ago, so now the monks are in their 3-month rain retreat period. And we had just a little bit of rain earlier, so hopefully if I start to speak really fast, it might mean that there's some rain coming. So in the Buddhist teachings, there's a kind of very interesting paradox, and that paradox is that there's a need to use a sense of self. There's a need to use this idea of I am, but there's also a need to go beyond it. There's also a need to escape it. And this kind of, his teachings on a kind of sense of self tend to occur in two main forms as far as things that hold people back, as far as things that make people unhappy. The first one is called Sakaya-ditthi. And this is basically what you might call a more gross, a more kind of substantial view of the self. It's basically the view that there's a soul. It's kind of this view that either the body is myself, so this is a kind of, you might call like a commonly held view. This might be like similar to the scientific view that the brain is basically the mind is the brain, and that everything that a person is basically bound up with the physical components of their body, and so after death there's nothing left. Or it could be that form, so that's form, it could be feelings, it could be my perceptions are myself, and this is kind of things like, you know, I have a, you know, I'm a person with this job, I'm a person with this skill set. It could be kind of sankharas, this kind of what they call mental formations. These are generally things like thoughts, more complex emotions. I'm a person with who can reason really well with these kind of skills. Or it can be consciousness, which is basically the aspect that watches, that knows these things. And this is a kind of gross sense of self. Whenever a person gets bound up with these things, whenever they believe that one of these things is their self, that they kind of own this thing, and that this kind of thing has things that it owns, that's when a lot of suffering can come into their life. That's when a lot of kind of difficulties come into their life. The second kind is more subtle. It's called asmimana. And this basically just means the conceit I am. It's kind of more subtle. So even after a person gets rid of this gross idea that they have this kind of soul, or they have this kind of, you know, their body is their self, their feeling is their self, their moods, their emotions, their thinking, their consciousness is their self, they still have this kind of subtle view behind all that, that kind of creates a sense of identity around these things. Now this is kind of something that's actually, to a certain extent, necessary to function in the world. And kind of, you know, I'm a person with these skills and abilities. I'm a person who fits into this category. I'm a person who fits into that category. These are things that we need when we're interacting with other people. These are things that we need in order to know, you know, what we should develop, what we should abandon. So actually they're even relevant on the path of the Dhamma. They're even relevant in developing skills in, say, meditation, skills in, say, virtue. A person has to know, you know, or think, you know, I want to become a virtuous person. But there's also elements So there's these elements where they can be used, this kind of sense of self can be used on the path. But there's also elements where this sense of self can kind of get in the way. And this is kind of perhaps one of the ways in which a lot of suffering can occur for people in their day-to-day life, and kind of having a very strong sense of self about various things. So one of the things when, I remember when I was living in Toronto, sometimes we go to these different meditation sessions and things like this. And some of the questions that people would ask, some of the suffering that people experience that goes on in their life can be explicitly connected with kind of feeling that somebody has hurt their sense of self, or somebody has damaged their sense of self, or somebody has offended their sense of self, whatever it might be. So there's sometimes people who their relatives, say things to them that aren't so nice. There's sometimes people who, their friends say things to them that aren't so nice. There's sometimes cultures where things get said about somebody, about a particular category that somebody's in, about a particular view of oneself that one has. And when this kind of thing happens, it can cause a trigger. This kind of trigger is a source of suffering in people's lives. It's a source of, can be a source of disease, can be a source of anger, can be a source of kind of depression. And so for this reason, the Buddhist teaches us about the removal of the sense of self. Well, this is one of the reasons, but it's a counterintuitive reason. Because on the one hand, we need to have this sense of self, but on the other hand, we need to work to remove it. So there's this kind of very important type of meditation, which is called the meditation on anatta, kind of a not self. I am not this is not me, this is not mine. And this kind of meditation is something that one can apply, especially to categories, identities, places, not places so much, but maybe categories, identities, views about oneself, about what one is, about what one should become. And one learns to apply these at the right time, in the right proportion, and in the right way. Because there's also times, as we mentioned, that we have to use this sense of self. So remember from my childhood, it's kind of very interesting. It's kind of my own personal example. People might not be able to tell from here. I'm in robes. I look maybe a little bit Sri Lankan. But I'm actually kind of, my father's side of the family is from Africa. My mother's side of the family is from Europe. And as a child, I grew up in a kind of very small rural town. Not rural really, but kind of very small, like smaller city outside of Toronto. And at that time, Canada was not, now it has many more kind of, it's probably more multicultural now than it was when I was young. And so in my school, I was kind of one of 4 black people in the whole kind of school. And so I remember being a very kind of young man, and you kind of learn to develop this kind of identity. I'm a black person, and people teach you what that identity means. And kind of, this is an identity that I have. This is how I should fit in with this particular identity. So it's kind of funny. Being a young kid, especially, you kind of learn this kind of with the other kids, sometimes in ways that aren't always so fun. And because of this, a person develops a sensitivity around whatever identity, around whatever focal point their kind of sense of self is, and the definitions that other people put on one. Whatever these definitions are, then one can develop a sensitivity around them. And there can be a kind of reason for this. There can be kind of a good reasons for this. But it was kind of funny when I was young, so kind of living here, I used to be kind of, get a little bit of flack for being, maybe too dark-skinned. This is kind of when I was young. I think many things have changed now. But then later on in life, as kind of I got to my teenage years, it was kind of funny because all of a sudden rap music started to become very popular. And with the popularity of rap music, it suddenly became a kind of very popular thing to be black. It kind of was, it was a thing to be. It was this kind of very sudden shift around like 1996 or so that I remember very clearly. And then at that time, if you had European genes and you were part black, this is kind of my own experience, then people would put that identity on you. Like, oh, you're too, you have too much of this particular identity. And so these kind of identities that people have, these kind of things that are a source of suffering, can be something that other people put on one, and other people define for one, that other people label one, and that other people have perceptions about. And if a person doesn't conform to those perceptions, then other people can sometimes get angry. And so this is a thing, when one comes to the Buddhist teachings, it's not really possible. When one comes to the Buddhist teachings, one comes to the Buddhist teachings with the desire to eliminate basically all forms of suffering. And it's not really possible. One thing one learns is that it's not really possible to shape the whole world so that everybody always says or does things or always acts in different ways that are pleasing to one. That everybody always speaks in ways that are pleasing to one. That everybody always looks at one in ways that are pleasing to one. There is often the times that people will say things that offend one's self-sense identity, that attack one's sense of self-identity, that kind of prick one's sense of self-identity. And this can be either intentional or unintentional. So the Buddha's teachings on this are, as we mentioned, cultivating this attitude of kind of anatta, this attitude of this is not me, this is not mine, this is not myself. And so for my case, in that case at least, it was kind of funny. So on the one hand, as a young man, and kind of people would think, oh, you know, you're a black man. And kind of on the other hand, is so you're too white. And in either of these cases, which one is true? Both of those are kind of perceptions that people will label. And so since I've come to Sri Lanka and started wearing robes, it's kind of funny because everybody thinks I'm Sri Lankan. Or when I'm wearing robes in Thailand, everybody thinks I'm Thai. I've kind of, that was kind of funny that people thought I was Thai. So even in the here and now, even in this life, whatever a sense of self-identity one has, there's these ways of perceiving it that break it down. And kind of when somebody says, this is just my own example, kind of to share my own kind of personal experience with that, is that, people might perceive one in these different ways. But what is it really? And kind of, on the one hand, as a young man, you might be this way. Middle, you might be this way. You go to a different country, people have a different perception this way. And all of these perceptions contribute to a person's sense of self-identity, what it is that a person can do based on that self-identity, what it is that they can't do based on that self-identity, and what it is that will cause a person to get angry, depending on how or when or whatever it is that sense of self-identity gets pricked, or depressed if they feel they lose that sense of self-identity, or unhappy if they're conjoined with a sense of self-identity that they don't like. So in the Buddha's teachings, what we learn to do as we go forward is we always have to have, there's teachings about the development of wholesome qualities. So one knows when one's mind is growing in wholesome qualities, one knows when one's mind is decreasing in wholesome qualities. And learning to know this is actually a kind of sense of self, in a certain sense. I am a person who is becoming more generous. I am a person who's becoming less generous. I am a person who's keeping better morality. I am a person who's keeping worse morality. Whatever the case might be, one learns to have this kind of sense of self-identity around it. This is something that I want to be. This is something that I want to become. This is something that I want to abandon. This is something that I want to get rid of. In all these things, there's this sense of asmimana, this sense of kind of having a self to it. So when one learns to practice the Dhamma in this way, it shifts one's sense of self-identity from whatever the categories and perceptions there might be in the world. In the world, there's basically an unlimited almost number of categories of self-identity. It can be the case that people categorize themselves and categorize others in ways that either judge themselves as better, judge themselves as worse, or judge themselves as being equal to another person. In other words, one has this status vis-a-vis others, so that one knows, how to behave to them or whatever. And sometimes this can be beneficial if one is looking to grow in wholesome qualities, but other times, the times that probably many people in the world have had experiences with, these kind of categorizations that other people will put on one, and that one can choose to accept or not oneself, these are things that can cause one a great deal of suffering. So as one learns to practice the Dhamma, one learns to take one's self-identity away from these various categorizations and place it more and more and more on the Dhamma itself. place it more and more and more on the Buddhist teachings itself. So one sense of self-identity gets less bound up with, say, like in my own example, like being an African man or being a half-African, whatever it might be, being a Canadian man, being whatever it is, whatever sense of self-identity there may be, one learns to shift that sense of self-identity and develop it more in line with the Dhamma, develop it more in line with the Buddhist teachings. So it was kind of interesting. Remember at a certain point, this is again just sharing my own experience as a young man. I think when hip hop started to get popular, and then it was kind of people were kind of being black was a thing to be, and then some people were like kind of at that time I grew up with in a largely kind of it was mainly people of European descent in that town that I was in, and so I didn't know all the cultures and mannerisms of like urban hip hop when hip hop first came out. And so for that reason, when I went to high school, people sometimes used to make fun of me, because I had kind of dark skin, but I didn't know these mannerisms. And so I remember at a certain point, I just got kind of fed up. I was like, if on the one hand, it's going to be like people castigate you, or, not castigate, but, if people look down on you for being too black, on the other hand, it looks down on you for being too white. I'm giving up this sense of self-identity associated so much with being, say, a black man. Instead, I'm going to focus my sense of self-identity on virtue. Actually, that wouldn't have been high school that I thought that, but it would have been maybe later on, university, something like this. And so what this is essentially is it's a kind of, when one tries to shift one's attention in this way, one is shifting one's attention from the categories, from the self-identities of the world, which aren't necessarily helpful, and shifting them to the categories and self-identities of the Dhamma. In other words, I don't care if people are this way or whatever, I care if people are virtuous. I don't care if people belong to this or that category, I care if people are generous. And in this way, one's self-identity becomes more bound up with the Dhamma. And this is a healthy sense of self-identity. It's a sense of self-identity that one needs in order to move forward in one's practice of the Buddhist teachings. But the funny thing about even all these sense of self-identities is that they're all subject to breaking down. Actually, in the Buddhist teachings, there's a very strong teaching of rebirth, a strong teaching that this is not the only life and that there are other lives that people have. And the Buddha says, in one sutta, I can't remember where it was, but so I remember reading this kind of, you think of all the various types of animals that have been extinct, all the, dinosaurs. He didn't mention dinosaurs, but all these various animals kind of over the ages. And these are all the forms that the mind can take on. The mind can take on many forms, not just human form, can be deva, all these various things. And so even the identity with a body, even the identity as a human is something that can change. It's something that doesn't belong to one. It's something that's not permanent. It's something that's not one's true self. And so it's something that one wants to learn to move beyond. All categories of identity, all categories of identification. And this is when one's practice of the Dhamma, one's practice of the elimination of self-identity starts to move beyond just, maybe starts to move beyond, but is something that can lead beyond just kind of thinking about having a soul, per se, to moving to learning to view, learning to kind of investigate this asmimana, this kind of conceit that I am, this kind of conceit that I exist. Because whatever it is, whatever constituents make up a person, whatever constituents make up a being, all these things are subject to changing. All these things are subject to moving. All these things are not me, they're not mine, they're not something that I own, they're not self. So in this sense, the Buddhist teachings are radical. They're not something that is, say, always going to be pleasant to practice. The path to the end of suffering is kind of something that it's like a road. Maybe sometimes that road will go through pleasant parks. Maybe sometimes that road will go through, pleasant meadows. But there's going to be other times that it might go through very difficult terrain, might go through very uneven terrain, might go through terrain that isn't so pleasant to look at. And in the same way, in a person's quest to find the end of suffering, the road, one of the pathways that one has to travel on this is this pathway to the destruction of one's attachment to any sense of self. It's funny because as a monk going to train in a monastery, this is one of the most kind of I guess what you might say is basic elements of a monastic training. Is when you go to a monastery, one of the early things that they tend to test in various ways is whether or not you can tolerate hearing things that are unpleasant to hear. And kind of, there's of course teachings, there's kind of ways that the Dhamma is expressed, ways that the senior monks will teach that are pleasant, that one likes to hear. Kind of one likes to hear praise, one likes to hear things that are good, good about oneself. One likes to hear things that are in line with one's views, in line with the way that one thinks the world is, in line with the way that one thinks one should practice, in line with the way that one thinks the monastery should be, that one thinks that Buddhism should be, that one thinks that the senior monk should be. One likes to hear these things, and by and large, I mean, it is that way. Kind of, tends to be that way. The kind of, generally, it's not like every day you hear something terribly unpleasant and this kind of thing. It's usually mostly kind of people living harmoniously, trying to live harmoniously, and practicing together. But one of the early tests that one will tend to undergo, there's usually always this kind of probationary period in most monasteries, is that usually, from what I've seen, senior monks will sometimes observe how you do in situations that challenge your sense of self, challenge your sense of who you are, what rights you have, what kind of entitlements you have. Because these aspects of the Dhamma that lead beyond one's sense of self, or one of the reasons these aspects of the Dhamma that lead beyond the sense of self, that lead to things that we can't see, are sometimes things that aren't always pleasant to hear, are sometimes things that one may wish were another way, are sometimes things that one can feel resentment about, feel depression about, feel anxiety about, and yet it's these things that's going beyond these things that actually leads one to have much less suffering in their life, leads one to have much less ease in their, or much more ease in their life. So I remember there's kind of one time I was, when I was a young monk, I used to be kind of, still kind of very much like the monastic rules, but really got into the monastic rules, really started to kind of enjoy them. And the monastic rules are kind of, they're not necessarily like a legal law code in say, Canada or the United States or something like this, where every aspect, every detail is spelt out. So what tends to happen is there's all these various rules, and then there's these gray areas, where it's kind of, is this part of the rule? Is this not part of the rule? Is this an offense? Is this not an offense? And because I liked to study these things, I get really into the kind of details of the rule. But tended to find that there was only so much fine tuning that I could do, only so much detail orientation that I could do, and then it became ambiguous. And that ambiguousness can sometimes make you uncertain. Oh, did I break this rule? Did I not break this rule? So there was one senior monk who was kind of very skilled in the Vinaya, and I'd often come to him with these kind of questions about rules and kind of, is this a breach of the rule? Is this not a breach of the rule? Did I break this rule? Did I not break this rule? And I would do it, a fairly reasonable amount of time. And then there was one day, it was one day I kind of called him up. I wasn't staying in that country anymore, but or at his monastery anymore, but I called him up, and I was kind of out, and I called him to ask him about this offense. And I called him immediately on the phone when I called him, he's like, what's up? Kind of this very harsh, hard voice. And then I asked him about the rule, and he said, go reread, this and this and this in the kind of in this kind of Vinaya book. And then I said, okay, thank you. And I quickly got off the phone, and he hung up. And so it was kind of a 3 or 4 second conversation, or not 3 or 4 second, but maybe a minute or 2, 3 conversation. And so at the end of that conversation, his language was kind of very harsh, his tone was very angry. But at the end of that conversation, I realized what he was trying to teach me was, you shouldn't be so worried about the details of these rules. And if you keep asking these, you're going to get into trouble. And kind of not necessarily from a senior monk, but this will be bad for your practice. And sometimes it's these non-verbal cues. It's these kind of cues that point out something that offends one's sense of self. I like to get into this detail orientation. But pointing out that this is actually unskillful at a time when one can really see it. It's the kind of skill of a very good teacher. And so having received that lesson, it was a wonderful lesson, something that was a real blessing, but obviously not something that was necessarily going to be pleasant to hear. Obviously not something that I might necessarily have maybe not necessarily thought that he would do or anticipated that was going to be, called him up thinking he's definitely going to say like this. But it was a valuable lesson. And so when one learns to reduce one's sense of self, this is possibly why this is one of the reasons this is a basic element in monastic training, is one opens oneself up to learn from things that one didn't expect, to learn from turns of phrases, learn from teachers, learn from events that one may have found unpleasant before, that may have offended one's sense of self before, that may have caused one to become depressed before, angry before. Whatever it is, when one learns to reduce one's sense of self through this perception of anatta, the things that impinge on one's senses, one is more able to turn those to the Dhamma. One is more able to search for the lesson in them, and one is more able to use them to alter one's behavior. And this is a key element, especially in monastic training, or in any type of Buddhist training where a person wants to move forward to seeing their own defilements and to finding a way to eliminate them, to finding a way to find happiness. This is one of the reasons the Buddha says that this kind of somebody who points these things out is like somebody who points out hidden treasure. And when one has kind of these nice experiences like this, where somebody has really helped one, and kind of, you can sense that their attitude isn't some kind of angry attitude, then one develops a lot of gratitude for them. One develops a feeling that this person has really done one a kind of great gift. Because this is the thing about the Buddhist teachings, is that not just senior monks, but actually in the Buddhist teachings, in the canon, if one reads the monastic rules, if one reads the Pali Canon, one will likely find things that will butt up against what one feels is good. Maybe not good is the right word, but what one feels might be kind of nice. Sometimes the Buddha is very kind of plain spoken. Sometimes he says things in a way that's very, might sound harsh. But all these kind of ways that he's saying these things kind of come because there's certain things that one needs to point out in a way that's kind of more clear. And so when one is able to learn from these things, then one is able to move forward in seeing things that one didn't see before. One is able to move forward in finding this kind of hidden treasure. So it's kind of interesting, this kind of same monk as well, what he said to me one time was that, one time he was giving a talk, and after the talk, this person came up to him, this lady came up to him and said, I was really mad at you this whole talk. And it was and I couldn't figure out why. And then later on, I figured out it was because I didn't know what your buttons were. I didn't know what buttons you could have pressed that would make you angry. And he said, well, that's why we wear robes. And he's kind of joking, you couldn't see his buttons. But also he meant it that kind of, this is kind of a generic model. We don't have these kind of various big senses of self protruding out, ideally as a monk. And so it's kind of like, I remember when I was young, there used to be these kind of video games. You'd press the button, press the button, press the button, press the button, to play this game. And eventually the button would get depressed sometimes. You couldn't press it anymore. And so it can be like that with our sense of self. This kind of thing, whatever category it is that people place on us, whatever identity it is that can get assaulted, that can be lost, that can be gained, that gives rise to a sense of pride, that gives rise to a sense of elation, that gives rise to a sense of depression when it's lost, that gives rise to a sense of anger when it's offended. Whatever these identities are, they're like buttons. And it's good to have the button pressed in. It's good to have the buttons wrapped with a robe or eliminated so that people can't press them anymore. Because when this is possible, when our sense of self is reduced, this is when we have the opportunity to see beyond it. This is when we have the opportunity to see beyond the categorizations that people put on us, to see beyond the definitions that they put on us and that we put on ourselves that limit ourselves, to see beyond it to possibilities for growth in the Dhamma, to see beyond it to possibilities for development of wholesome qualities, for the elimination of unwholesome qualities, and to see beyond it so that those who care about us can show us a path to hidden treasure, treasures that we haven't seen before, treasures in our own mind, treasures that lead to happiness, and treasures that place us on the path to Nibbana. Okay, so leave that for reflection, and hope that everybody has a great day, and wishing you all the best. Okay, bye for now.